Last couple weeks, been a good last couple weeks. We had VBS and we had a group from Arkansas, which is always an encouragement. I know for me it is, especially to have Billy around. Billy is just a happy guy, and it's good to spend time with him. But we had a good week of VBS. I think the largest number we had was close to 90, wasn't it? Or right over 90 one night. So we had several from the community, so that was really good. It was a good week. Got a lot done, a lot of doors knocked, and got some contacts from that, so that's good. Then last week we had Bible camp, which a good chunk of the congregation was gone to camp last week, and we had around 57 kids and 20 staff, and we were all preparing and bracing for the worst weather ever last week, and it actually turned out to be pretty great. Every day it rained at least once or twice, and we had cloud cover, we had a breeze. It was a really good week. We only had a couple times it was pretty humid. A couple nights it was hard to go to sleep. It was cool, but it was really humid. But I'm not going to complain. It could have been 105. So I'm good with that. But it was a good week. This morning, you notice you do not have an outline in your bulletin. I did not get an outline written out this week since it was a busy week. But there were some things that's been on my mind I've been thinking about. And our scripture reading was from John 3, verse 16 and 17. You know, verse 16 is definitely a very popular passage. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. You know, we go through that verse. We don't think a lot. I don't think the world, because it's, the most popular verse in the world. People really think about that statement. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. You think about that statement and what that means. You know, we sing many songs about Jesus' blood. We sing many songs about Jesus being our Redeemer. We sit down every first day of the week and we partake of the Lord's Supper in remembrance of the sacrifice that Christ made. How much do we think about what that means and what he has done for us? You think about the world many times just uses that statement and goes on. Maybe we even do it ourselves. We say, well, Christ died for me, and I'm thankful for that. But how often do we sit down and read about that night that Jesus suffered for you and I? And that night and days, the 3 days, or the period of time before he was risen, and what that means. So what I want to do this morning is go to Matthew chapter 27. And I want to start at midnight, basically about midnight, in the events, what led up to the crucifixion. In Matthew chapter 27, we have Jesus, actually go back to chapter 26. Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper. Verse 26 and preceding, we see that Jesus predicts Peter betraying him. And, Peter is very adamant that he's not going to. And all of the events that led up to this, Jesus knew what was going to happen. You and I, as humans, do not know the future. We don't know what's going to happen. The only thing that we are sure of is, as a Christian, we know that there is eternity waiting on us. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. We don't know what the next 5 minutes is going to bring. But Jesus, being God, knew everything that was going to happen. Everything that was going to happen to him, all the events that led up to what was going to happen, he knew. And so keep that in mind as we begin in verse 36. Matthew 26 and verse 36. Jesus goes, he's in Jerusalem, and he goes across this valley, and it goes to Gethsemane. In verse 36 then says, Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and said to the disciples, Sit here while I go and pray over there. And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. Jesus goes into the garden to pray. Now, there's two words that are interesting here used in describing Jesus. And Jesus himself even says he is sorrowful. That's the first one. Sorrowful. That word means to be overwhelmed with great anguish. Why is Jesus overwhelmed with great anguish? Well, as we already stated, he knew it was going to happen. He knew what he was going to have to go through. He knew what was required of him and what his purpose in coming to earth was. Think about the anguish, the human side of him saying no, wanting to run, wanting to go hide from what was going to happen. But not only that, the word deeply distressed. The word deeply distressed means to be heavy, great anguish, depressed. Several dictionaries use that word depressed. You know, last week at camp we looked at a week of refuge. One of the days that we looked at, one of the themes of one of the days was depression. And the way that we see depression is going on in this world, and how to deal with those things, how to be joyful. And when I think about that, I think about Hebrews chapter 12. Go with me to Hebrews 12. And look at verse 1 and 2. Hebrews chapter 12. In verse 1 and 2. It says, Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy, this is not happiness, this is joy, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. We had one of our kids last week asked us a question: what is the difference between happiness and joy? You know, happiness is a feeling. And when someone gives you something, maybe somebody gives you a hug, or somebody gives you something that you've really wanted, that's happiness. That you have that feeling of happiness. Joy, on the other hand, is a mindset. And we really see what joy is in Hebrews 12, verse 2, because Jesus knew what he was going to have to endure on the cross. Yet for the joy that was set before him, the joy that he knew what was going to be the outcome of what he would do, helped him to endure that. It was a mindset. He could overcome the trials that was before him. And so when we go back to Matthew chapter 26, and you see this word deeply distressed, Jesus was depressed. He had great anxiety and great anguish of knowing what was going to happen. And his human side was wanting him to stop. His human side wanted him to not endure that. But yet we know from Hebrews 12, he had a joy knowing what the outcome would be. He continued on. And so verse 38, he desires for his friends, his apostles, to stay there with him and watch with him. So verse 39, it says he went a little farther. This is back in Matthew 26. He went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Jesus didn't want to endure what was coming. It says, not as I will. That's his human nature. Human nature tells us, I don't want to go to the cross. I don't want to be beaten. I don't want to be mocked. I don't want to be betrayed. I don't want to go through that. That's human nature. I don't want to do that. Yet he says, but as you will. He knew what he needed to do. He's praying for that strength. Verse 40, then he came to his disciples and found them sleeping and said to Peter, "What, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Notice he goes back and he addresses Peter. I think that's interesting that instead of just saying to those that were with him, he says directly to Peter, "You could not stay up awake for an hour with me?" And I think about that, and I think about Peter. Peter is that type A personality. He was the one that was always eager to say, "I will not betray you. I will not deny you. I will be with you till the end." Yet here in a moment of weakness, in a moment of where Jesus needed that comfort, where was Peter? Fell asleep. And so I think he's trying to teach Peter something here. But you see what he's going through. If you go to Luke chapter 22 and verse 44, Luke in his account says that he starts to perspire drops of blood. This is a medical condition called hemohydrosis that is known to the pores on someone's body will burst and they'll start to have blood from anxiety. And this is what he's going through. You can see the turmoil he's going through, knowing what's coming. And so verse 42, Matthew 26 and verse 42, says, "Again a second time he went away and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me, unless I drink it, your will be done. And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them, went again, and prayed the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Jesus knew Judas was going to do what he did. And I think it's interesting. Here they are in the garden. He's praying that this would not happen to him. He knows Judas is coming. He doesn't just go hide. He goes, let's go meet them. He goes right to them. He says, it's time to go. See, my betrayer's at hand. And the next verse, while they were speaking, they come together. They meet one another. Jesus didn't go hide. He didn't say, hey, I know he's coming. He goes to meet him. He knows what needs to happen. So verse 47 says, And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now his betrayer had given him a sign, saying, Whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him. Immediately he went up to Jesus and said, Greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. But Jesus said to him, Friend, why have you come? Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and took him. And so notice, Jesus calls Judas his friend. Judas had spent 3.5 years with Jesus every day, just like the other apostles. They knew. Judas saw the same miracles. Judas saw the same healing that Jesus did. He heard the same teachings. Yet for 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, he betrayed Jesus. Some want to say, well, Judas didn't think that they were going to actually kill him. Judas was just trying to look for a way of getting some extra money. We don't know that. All we know is that Judas was willing to betray his friend for 30 pieces of silver. I think that's interesting how Jesus addresses him. Friend, why have you come? Did Jesus know? He did. Just like in Genesis chapter 3, when God came into the garden and asked Adam and Eve where they were, what they had done, God knew. What was he trying to do? Get Judas to think about what he had done. And so we get to verse 51. It says, And suddenly of one of those who was with Jesus stretched out his hand, drew his sword, and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Matthew doesn't tell us who it is, but It's Peter. Again, Peter, the eager one to make a move at all times, to get out of that boat, to walk on the water, to say that a powerful statement in Matthew 16 about who Jesus was, that he was the Son of God. He was the one that immediately pulled out his sword and cut off that servant's ear. But notice verse 52. But Jesus said to him, put your sword into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that it cannot be? I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must have happened thus? Jesus said, if I wanted to be protected, I could have called for 10,000 angels as we sing, those 12 legions of angels. You think about the power of an angel. Back in the time of Hezekiah, one angel killed 175,000 Assyrians. So if Jesus called for 10,000 angels, what he could have done, but he didn't. He knew, as he stated there, the scriptures had to be fulfilled. He knew that this had to happen. And so he tells Peter to stand down. So verse 55 says, in that hour Jesus said to the multitudes, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I sat daily with you, teaching in the temple, and you did not seize me. But all this was done that scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. And notice, before I read the last part, if you go over to Luke 22 and verse 51, Jesus takes and heals that servant's ear. The servant of the high priest who came to take him bound to the Sanhedrin, bound to Pilate, bound to be put to death, Jesus still showed mercy and kindness to that man and healed his ear. Even through all of this, what was on Jesus' mind? You and me. Others, not himself. And so verse 56, it says, when all this was done, that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled, then all the disciples forsook him and fled. Did any of them stay around to follow them? No, they all ran. They all dispersed. So not only is Jesus now arrested, he's been abandoned by the people that he spent his life with, his last 3.5 years with. He was abandoned. And so we get down to verse 57 through, I'm not going to read all of this, but verse 57 through about 62, we see him brought before Caiaphas, which we talked about. He is the high priest made by Rome. And here he's in front of the Sanhedrin. Notice, what time of night is this? It's after midnight. All of this is being done in the middle of the night. They bring false witnesses against him. According to Exodus 23, verse 1 and 2, that was forbidden by God to bring false witness against someone. They were directly disobeying the law of God there. They didn't care. Verse 59 through 60, we see the false accusing. Verse 60 shows us that they brought false witnesses forward and made all of these accusations against him. But I want to look at verse 62. It says, and the high priest arose and said to him, do you answer nothing? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus kept silence. And the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus, verse 64, said to him, it is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Jesus, the only thing he says is that he is king and he will be sitting upon his throne. Well, you think about what that's going to be like for the Sanhedrin to hear. Look at verse 65. Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, he has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think? They answered and said, he is deserving of death. Then they spat in his face and beat him. And others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you? So they do two things. Well, three things. They spit in his face. That is a sign of distaste for someone. If you spit in someone's face, that's a big sign of disrespect. And that's what they did. And not only that, it says they hit him. This is the word used here means they took a clenched fist and they punched him. They were beating him. They were so angry. And then they would take the palms of their hands and they would hit him on the mouth. And that was an idea of trying to get him to stop. And they would mock him. And so you have him being abandoned. You have him being falsely accused, falsely charged. Now he's being mocked. Then verse 69. Now Peter sat outside the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him, saying, You also were with Jesus of Galilee. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you are saying. And when he had gone out to the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, This fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth. But again he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. And a little later there came up and said to him, those who stood by came up to him, Surely you are one of them, for your speech betrays you. Then he began to curse and swear, saying, I do not know the man. Immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the words of Jesus, who had said to him, Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So he went out and wept bitterly. Peter was probably his closest friend here on earth. You had Peter, James, and John, who were very close to him, who were there at the Mount of Transfiguration, who saw other healings that others did not get to see. Peter was his closest friend, and at the worst time, he betrays him. He denies him. He leaves him. And so, think about all that Jesus is going through, all happening in the middle of the night. So chapter 27 and verse 1, it says, When the morning came, the people continued to plot against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate the governor. And so you read through, you see that Judas goes off and hangs himself. Verse 11 through 14, Jesus is faced with Pilate. But I want to start in verse 15. It says, Now at the feast the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. And at that time they had a notorious prisoner named called Barabbas. Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ? For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, Have nothing to do with this just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him. First thing, Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent. Pilate knew that the only reason they brought Jesus to him is because of envy. It's stated there. And so Pilate's wife comes to him and says, Do have nothing to do with this man. Do not do anything to him. Notice she says he is a just man. What does that mean? He's righteous. He's innocent. He didn't do anything. And not only that, she says, she's had a restless night of sleep because of what she has seen of this man in her dreams. I guarantee God had a part in that. And so she's warning him to be careful what he does. In verse 20, But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. Notice the key word there. The chief priests and elders persuaded. The people, or the elders and the chief priests, had such a great hatred for Christ that they created this mob. They worked the crowd up to turn Barabbas loose, who was a murderer, who was known to be one that was who was definitely not innocent in what he had done. And so verse 21, it says, The governor answered and said to them, Which of the two do you want me to release to you? And they said, Barabbas. Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" They all said to him, "Let him be crucified." Then the governor said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water, washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it." And all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and our children," as the King James says, forever. Think about that. They hated him so much that they wanted the price of, or the sin of what they had done to not only be on them, but their generations to follow. That's crazy. Think about the hatred they had for him to want that. Did they really understand what they were saying? Verse 26, then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. When we think about scourging, scourging was done to basically cause the person to not be recognizable when they were done. It was to get them to the point to where when they actually hung on that cross, that they would not spend much time. They would die soon. And that's exactly what was done to Jesus. And so we go over to verse 32. Verse 32, it says in chapter 27, it says, "Now as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. And when they had come to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, place of a skull, they gave him sour wine mingled with gall to drink. But when he tasted it, he would not drink." This concoction here was a kind of a little bit of mercy given to the person that was going to be crucified. It was a painkiller. It would have dulled the pain of what they were going to endure. Did Jesus take it? No. Why? I think that's interesting. Why Jesus didn't take that. I think about that, and I think that maybe he wanted to make sure that he knew and was staying aware of exactly what he was going through that whole time. I guarantee most people took that, if not all, but Jesus didn't. He would not take that painkiller. And so verse 35, then they crucified him and divided his garments, casting lots, that it may be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Sitting down, they kept watch over him there, and they put over his head the accusation against him, written against him, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Now I want to go down to verse 45. It says, "Now from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness over all the land. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This was a direct quote from the Psalms. And Jesus uses that to show us the agony that he was going through, the intense suffering that he was going through. So verse 47 says, "Some of those who stood there when they heard that said, 'This man is calling for Elijah.' Immediately one of them ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it in a reed and offered it to him to drink. The rest said, 'Let him alone. Let us see if Elijah will come to save him.' And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit." Jesus died. When you think about the intense suffering that Jesus went through, all these things that he went through, the abandonment, the betrayal, the denying of his closest friend, the beatings, everything that he went through, he was innocent. He didn't deserve to be there. You know, when we sit down and we partake of the Lord's Supper, do we think about that? Do we think about what he went through, the suffering that he went through for you and me? You know, Romans 3 and verse 23 says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." Each one of us here, me, myself, deserves to be in the place that Jesus was in. Romans 6 and verse 23 says, "For the wages of sin is death." I deserve to be on that cross, not him. But go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Actually, let's go to 1 Peter 2 first. 1 Peter chapter 2. Look at verse 21 through 25. 1 Peter 2, verse 21 through 25. It says, For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who when he was reviled did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. When you think about John 3 and verse 16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Jesus went through that suffering so that he could bear our sins. He could bear our consequences that we deserved. He did that for you and I. Why? Go to 2 Corinthians 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Look at verse 21. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21 says, For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us. What that means is he made Christ bear our sins, our consequences, who knew no sin, who was innocent, who had no sin. Why? That we might become the righteousness of God in him. He did it so that you and I could be righteous. He did it so that you and I could have salvation. And so notice, where is that righteousness at? It is in him. It's in Christ. So this morning, if you are not a Christian, I encourage you to think about the consequences that your sin has caused and that should come upon each one of us. What I have done, what you have done. And think about how Christ went to that cross for you and I. I pray as we sit down and we partake of the Lord's Supper, when we sing songs about him as our Redeemer, when we read passages and make statements about how Christ died for you and I, we really think about what that means and what he went through, the consequences that he endured for you and I. And if you're not a Christian, I encourage you to put on Christ, to have his blood that he shed for you and I covering you so that you could go to eternity with him forever. And if you have fallen away, I pray that you make a change today and come back. And I pray that you do it now as we stand and as we sing.